The Lionel Gelber Prize is awarded every year to the best book on international affairs. To mark the 25th anniversary, we spoke with 5 Gelber winners. I asked them how the world has changed. My name is John Stackhouse, and here is what I learned. We're at Oxford University, where Lionel Gelber began his academic career, and I'm joined by Paul Collier, Professor of Economics and author of The Bottom Billion. Professor Collier, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for interviewing me, and let me say thank you to the Gelber Committee, because the Gelber Committee was the first prize award that the Bottom Billion won. It's since won quite a lot, but you started it.
Professor Collier, let's start by looking back at the last quarter century, a period of extraordinary economic growth, global trade, proliferation of technology. From the perspective of the Bottom Billion, what did the quarter century mean?
So the quarter century started on a note of high hope because of a wave of democratization. And a lot of us had thought that one of the real difficulties with the countries of the Bottom Billion was that they were misgoverned by dictators, which they were. And in most of these countries, the dictators were swept away. So that was the onset of a period of hope. And then the first decade of the 21st century was actually, in some respects, an even more benign decade for the Bottom Billion. They got onto an economic bonanza of rising commodity prices, the right side of the super cycle. In the middle, I should say, there was an event which was huge for the world, but not for the Bottom Billion, which was the global economic crisis. Their financial systems didn't collapse like a pack of cards. They actually proved that over the previous 20 years, they'd basically put their macroeconomic house in order.
You're attributing their success to domestic economic policy, and others might point to the role of international organizations like the IMF and the role they've played in crises. I wonder if you're giving more credit to the Bottom Billion and their economic management than perhaps others have.
There's a bit of both. For example, I run an annual conference for African central bank governors, and these are prudent and astute people. They're not straining under the leash of IMF control, wishing that it would go away and they could print money. Not one bit of it. Yes, it was useful to have the IMF, both for the technical advice and for the credibility. But fundamentally, a political elite learnt that macroeconomic disorder was just costly.
So are you arguing the wave of democratization in the 1990s was largely positive for the Bottom Billion?
Yes, it swept away dictators, and the autocrats had been pretty awful. At least they've been awful, if not pretty. But what's replaced that autocracy is often pretty dysfunctional democratic politics. First of all, no provision was made for political party finance. And so, effectively, the main source of political party finance became corruption. And secondly, the basis for organizing a party, a bunch of people who work together, became ethnic. And so you got politics further fragmenting and stratifying societies that were already pretty fragmented. There had never been a sense of shared identity in a nation. I'm a great admirer of the government of Ethiopia, also the government of Botswana, the government of Rwanda. Now, Botswana is a democracy. It would be harder to say that of Ethiopia and Rwanda, but even Botswana, political power has never actually changed hands since independence. So there's a party which contests elections very honourably, but it keeps winning. It's a little bit analogous to Singapore. It's well run. There's a national party that a lot of people support, and it stays in power. But they're clean. All three of these governments are clean. I know the leaders. I know they're clean. I see their houses. They live modestly, and they and their parties have built, you could call it an ideology or a narrative about, or an ethical norm about building the future. What is the role of leadership in a poor country? It's to transform opportunities for the next generation. And as part of that, they're working on a national identity, not a sectional identity.
As you argue in the bottom billion, many of the poorest countries are multi-ethnic and therefore harder to manage politically, especially as politics become more competitive, as you say, more exploitative and even more violent. Have many of the poorest countries managed to develop a successful multi-party system, or are we seeing a shift towards a dominant single national party approach?
I suspect that the sensible sequence is phasing. President Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, who was a great man, not power hungry. He stepped down eventually of his own volition, and he wasn't rapacious. He lived modestly. But President Nyerere said, basically, we can't afford multi-party democracy in the present circumstances, which were the circumstances post-independence. He said, I've not been bequeathed a country. I've been bequeathed 120 tribes. And we've got to forge those 120 different identities into a shared identity. And Nyerere adopted a range of very effective policies, a common language, new capital, making sure that civil servants didn't work in their own regions, a common educational curriculum, all building a sense of shared identity. And across the border in Kenya, successive generations of politicians did the opposite. They scratched the wound of ethnic fragmentation and made it worse. And that's produced a politics in Kenya, which is today very much harder to manage than the politics in Tanzania. So Tanzania has evolved to the stage where it can sort of do multi-party competition, but it's again on a bedrock of having built shared identity.
You talk in the bottom billion about a resource trap, and we've just come through an extraordinary commodity cycle. Some call it a super cycle. And I wonder what you think developing countries, especially the poorest countries, have learned from the last decade of boom, really, in the commodities sectors. And now that we've seen a significant correction in prices, what should they be prepared for?
The story for Africa is that the last decade was a decade of discovery, because the price increase triggered a lot of investment in prospecting. And where should you go and look? You should go and look in the least prospected places on earth, which was the countries of the bottom billion. You know, about a third of all the oil and gas discoveries in recent years have been in Africa. And so the last decade was the decade of discovery. The coming decade is the decade of extraction. Those discoveries are now going through the phase where there's a big investment in order to get the iron ore to port, or the oil or out of the ground, or the gas converted into liquid form. These are big investments, and that will come on stream during the present decade.
As countries see revenues grow in the decade ahead, do you have confidence they'll make wiser decisions on what to do with that money than we've seen in decades past?
Societies mainly learn through their own mistakes rather than reading a book or listening to a lecture. It's a hard school experience, but it's an effective school. Ghana's just made quite a big mistake. Oil was discovered in 2007. At that stage, Ghana was a pretty well-run economy. The oil came on stream in 2011. As we speak, there's an IMF team going into Ghana to do an emergency macroeconomic recovery program. So 3 years into the oil, they're in a macroeconomic mess.
At this stage, what are the key learnings from Ghana?
Ghana did some things that really looked right. It recognized that revenues should be used for the future, and so set up a sovereign fund for future generations, actually called a fund for future generations. And a couple of $100 million was put into that pot. But at the same time, the government of Ghana went out and borrowed about $2 billion on the international sovereign bond market. That's a great idea for Norway. It would be pretty dumb for a poor African country to do that. Norway only started its sovereign wealth fund when it already had more invested capital per worker than any other country in the world. So what Norway did was very sensible for Norway. It would be completely stupid for a country that is desperately short of investment. And so the social learning from a few mistakes is not just confined to the countries that make those mistakes. They become a social learning process across a region. I'm confident that as we go forward, that mistake will become less frequent.
Let's shift to trade. An extraordinary boom in global trade over the last 25 years. Yet, as you've argued in the bottom billion, the poorest nations did not get an appropriate share despite a cost advantage in many countries. Why would that be?
Yes, I mean, the bottom billion basically got commodity trade, natural resources. And indeed, as I explained in the bottom billion, there's a good reason for that, which was China. China has been through a phase where it was hyper-competitive. It had still had cheap labor, but it managed to build clusters of industry with powerful scale economies at the level of the city. So one of my favorite examples, which I think I didn't put in the bottom billion, but I should have done, is buttons, where 2/3 of all the buttons made in the world are made in one Chinese city, Buttonopolis. And why is that? It's not that the city has any natural advantage. You don't scratch under the pavements and find buttons, nor is there sort of Mega Button Incorporated there. There's just lots of small button firms all clustered together. And so it's very hard. If you're an African button maker, how do you compete with that? That's been the problem, and it's just changing because China's grown so fast that real wages have risen to the level where it's actually becoming cheaper to shift production to Africa. And there's one celebrated example of that, which just started about 3 years ago, which is the move of light manufacturing from China to Ethiopia. Now, in the bottom billion, I didn't anticipate that Ethiopia would be able to break in, because I thought, being landlocked, it was out of the game of manufacturing. But light manufacturing doesn't need a port as long as it's got a good airport hub. And Addis is a very good air hub. And so the cluster is now growing around Addis Airport. And the impetus for that is that a firm in China is paying $500 a month for a worker. When it moves to Addis, it's paying $50 a month. Now, productivity is a bit lower in Ethiopia. It's only about 70% of China at the moment, though it'll doubtless rise.
You've developed the idea of a conflict trap, and now you're arguing that countries have become much better at managing internal conflict. We've certainly seen a decline in war in Africa. Are you confident that this trend is established and that the shift to a peaceful Africa is perhaps even irreversible?
I think certainly the trends are favourable, not just in Africa, but globally. There are qualifications to it. One is the Sahelian region, which is fragile. And fundamentally, it's fragile because it's so poor that these societies cannot afford to protect themselves. They're too poor to buy peace. Just in the last 3 years, Mali suffered a devastatingly destabilizing invasion, which was from about 800 armed men. The spillover from Gaddafi. 800 armed men. The Malian army just wasn't up to defending the country against 800 armed men. Central African Republic, same sort of story. In each case, how was the situation salvaged? By the French flying in at the very last minute. Is that the source of solution that anybody wants, including the French? No, believe me, nobody wants that. And then there's another threat in countries which are not too poor to buy peace. Nigeria, Kenya will be major examples, where they're threatened from radical Islam. Nigeria and Kenya both have the financial resources to defend themselves. But the military is not an effective organization. African governments have struggled to build effective public organizations across the public sector. Teachers don't turn up to teach, nurses steal drugs, soldiers don't fight effectively to protect their fellow citizens. There it's a problem of building enough national identity that a military, which should be emblematic of national identity, of fighting, literally protecting your fellow citizens, the militaries work. The Sahel is a different order of problem. And there is a solution to the Sahel, but it really requires building some collective capacity for defense. I actually sketched this in the bottom billion. We want the equivalent to what America did for Europe in NATO. And now it's especially Europe's turn, but North America as well, to help Africa to build, to provide the logistics to Africa and the money, where Africans provide the troops to defend their own region. The region they've got to defend is the Sahel.
You talk about radical Islam. Of course, radical Islam has been present on African soil for decades in various forms. Should we take solace that it has not spread more or faster, or be concerned that it has threatened to topple some governments?
Will radical Islam topple the government of Nigeria? Of course not. Will it topple the government of Kenya? Of course not. Will it be a murderous nuisance for quite a few years? Yes. Fortunately, Africa, by and large, doesn't yet have the phenomenon that the Middle East is seeing, of which I would call conflict tourism, where bored young men who usually play video games in which they pretend to kill people sitting in Europe or Australia or I guess Canada think, gosh, I could do the real thing and go and kill people for real in Syria.
We've seen it in some corners, Somalia specifically, and Kenya via Somalia. You don't see it spreading?
That's true, but the Somali situation is kind of uniquely dysfunctional in Africa. The international community has actually left a country not just to fall apart, but to stay falling apart. In my view, that was a crazy thing to do. That the modern world shouldn't have pockets of ungoverned territory. It's just too dangerous. And one of the consequences of it is it attracts in conflict tourism from bored young Somalis in Canada or Europe, wherever.
Is radical Islam an existential threat to Sahelian Africa?
There's no groundswell of support for radical Islam in Africa. There's mischievous guys running armed groups, and bored and poor young men going to join them. Radical Islam does pose an existential threat in the Middle East, where societies really do seem to be divided, with significant groups of people wanting to revert to some mythical age of radical Islam.
There's massive digital change going on globally. Would you anticipate Africa playing a greater role or watching it largely from the sidelines?
Well, I don't know about continue to observe it from the sidelines. Google sent a team to Kenya, not to show the Kenyans how to do stuff, but to learn from the Kenyans how stuff was done, because Kenya has been very much on the frontier of using mobile technology to develop international payment systems. And mobile international payment systems offer huge opportunities for Africa. So some technologies are very good news for Africa. Some new technologies will be pretty bad news, I think. So the technologies are a fickle friend. Some technologies will discover substitutes for African resources. That'd be really bad news.
Casting forward to the next 25 years, for the bottom billion, are you more optimistic or pessimistic?
I try not to do optimism and pessimism. I try to do realism. Where are we now? We're at a point of big struggle over whether natural resources will become an opportunity that's harnessed or a mistake that's repeated. Got another big opportunity we've not talked about, which is urbanization. Between now and 2050, the urban population of Africa will triple. So another way of thinking of that is that 2/3 of Africa's urban environment is not yet built. That's a huge opportunity to leapfrog to 21st century cities. But if the 2/3 that's not built looks like the third that is built, instead of it being a leapfrog to the 21st century, it's a step back into not even the 19th century. These slums are worse than the 19th century slums of Europe. And so, as with natural resources, these are struggles that will play out. One big change coming from new technology is that the cost of protest has fallen a lot. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it's a wake-up call for government. It's a bad thing if it just leads to instability and cynicism, that anything that starts to be built up gets torn down. I can't see the future. What I see is struggles. Some will be won, some will be lost.
Would you categorize the mood among the bottom billion, if one can do that, as more hopeful or cynical?
It's both. These are genuinely hopeful societies. After all, Africa's growing quite fast. And it's projected to grow quite fast. Where else in the world can you say that phrase? Not many. Not many parts of the world. So there's a sense that Africa's growing. There's also a sense that Africa's future is going to be with young people. It's the youngest continent, and its demographics are starting to work in its favor. You're going to get a huge cohort of young workers. And that's a big chance. That's a big chance, because young workers are better at innovating. The cynicism, well, Africa's a young continent, the youngest continent, but it's got the oldest leaders. And so the gap between the age of ordinary citizens and the age of the leaders is far wider in Africa than anywhere else. Is that healthy? I don't think so. Right? So what do I hope? I hope that young Africans win their struggle, close that gap, and get leaders who are actually minded to develop the country. It's their struggle, not mine, but I hope they win it.
Professor Collier, thank you very much for joining us.
And thank you for inviting me.